Soy Bob Pop y hoy estoy aquí para hablaros de un libro que ha publicado la Editorial Anagrama y que me ha encantado. Es un libro que se llama Memorial. Lo ha escrito un autor joven norteamericano, se llama Bryan Washington. Es su primera novela y es una delicia. Y he tenido la suerte de que los señores y señoras de Anagrama me han dicho: ¿tú quieres hablar con Bryan Washington de Memorial? Le he dicho: pero por supuesto quiero hablar con Bryan Washington de Memorial porque es una novela maravillosa y él seguro que me cae muy bien porque alguien que ha escrito lo que ha escrito tiene que ser estupendo. Así es que no me enrollo más y saludo a Bryan Washington. Hi Bryan, how are you?
I'm doing well. Doing as well as I suppose anyone could be doing. Yes, so hopefully you're doing well as well. Yeah.
Yeah, well, yes, in this time we are doing the best we can.
Yes.
I was talking in Spanish. You have heard me, but maybe you didn't understand. Do you understand Spanish?
Yo entiendo, pero I can't speak very well at all.
Okay.
So it really just depends. But it's very Houston is a very Latino city, so
Yeah.
Spanish is integral to the lifeblood of the city.
So I was telling to the people who is watching us that I was going to talk with you because I love your novel, Memorial. I think is a very special novel, very powerful, and I loved it. So first of all, thank you very much. I was quite afraid of talking with you because I like the book so much. I need you to be a wonderful person because if not, I'm going to be so disappointed and sad that my life is going to crash.
Yeah, I'll do the best that I can to sort of meet you halfway at least. Yeah.
Well, first question, Bryan, is about the title, Memorial. What are you trying to make us remind, or which is this novel a memorial of?
That's a really great question. I think that a big part of the reason that Memorial stuck with me, because many things changed for me in the midst of writing the novel, but the title wasn't one of them, is that a memorial can be so many different things at the same time. It can be something that one mourns. It could be a hallmark that is humorous. It could be a memorial of a time of ambiguity or a time of transition or a time of flux. But inside of all of that, a memorial is something that calls on to be remembered for some reason or another, even if that reason changes as time passes. So I think that for each of these characters, while they may not necessarily characterize the events that occur in the novel as being significant for them in the midst of them occurring, it's perhaps a time that they'll look back upon as being a sort of memorial upon which many things changed afterward, or they discovered many different things about themselves, or they learned different things about themselves and the others around them that they may not have expected.
You said a lot of these changes changed during the writing of the novel. Did your life was changing while you were writing the novel?
Yeah, it took about 3 years to write the book. And in the midst of this, I had sold my first book to like my US publisher. So I was on the precipice, I think, of a number of professional changes. It was around that time that I started moving cities. I lived in New Orleans for a while, and then I moved back to Houston, which is where I grew up. And since then, I've split time between Houston and California. So there were literal place changes that were occurring. And of course, on the back end of editing the US version of the novel, the pandemic began, or the outset of the pandemic began. So there were a number of significant, I suppose, shifts that were occurring in my life, as I imagine so many folks in the midst of the ongoing pandemic, to say nothing of like the last few years alone. So while this was occurring, it wasn't something that I think I could have like spoken to competently or fluently. And it's only in the time since the book has been published that I've thought of just like how many different changes were occurring in the midst of my writing a book, in which so many different changes are occurring, both subtle and large, for the characters, that I've been able to sort of look back and say, have like a sense, of the way things have shifted and continue to shift.
And do you like talking about your writing, or do you prefer writing and letting the others understand what you wrote?
That's a really great question. I'm of two minds about it, you know? I mean, I'm someone who, as a reader and as a member of the audience, I appreciate when an author just provides the story for me and provides the characters, provides the scenes, provides the setting, creates enough of a foundation that I can just follow them wherever they lead me. If they've, you know, if they have a steady hand, or in by way of a steady hand, like a flexible enough hand. But it also brings me a lot of joy when folks are curious about the inner workings of a piece of fiction that I've written, whether it's from a thematic level, whether it's from like a structural standpoint, whether it's just like a matter of, you know, talking through like what I may have been thinking or what I've intended at a given time. Although I think I found simultaneously that the writer of a work is oftentimes like the absolute worst person to talk about that work or to have any sense of what is going on in that work. So I'm happy to talk about it, but it may not be as enlightening, you know, as it could be. Usually I found that like the folks who've taken the time to like read my work have much more interesting things to say about it than I do.
It's quite funny because I have several writers friends who always say that if you talk about this, you don't write about it. You have that some feeling that you are writing things you weren't able to talk fluently or freely, and you better write them.
Yes, yeah, significantly. I mean, I think that regardless of what I'm writing, but particularly for the fiction that I write, it's because there's a question that I'm circling around, or perhaps a conversation that I'm circling around that I may not necessarily have the answer for, or like the language for even. And it's through the construction of characters, of scenes, of scenarios, of various patterns and the ways that those patterns can be shifted, or those arcs can be shifted, that I'm able to come up with a clearer sense of like how I feel about a particular thing. And that isn't to say that I walk away with a project with like an answer to any of these questions, because it's very seldom that like I'll answer a question, or that I'll seek to have something figured out by the end of a project. But that's fine with me. Even as a reader, like I'm not necessarily looking to have suspicions confirmed, or, you know, queries answered by the end of a work. What I suppose is most exciting to me is when an author elongates a conversation, or if they are untangling a question that they may have, even if they don't necessarily end up with a concrete solution. It just brings, you know, the thought of it further along for me, hopefully to be taken up elsewhere by another author doing their own project with their own ways of working and thinking.
Yeah, but it's funny because some of your characters find the solutions or the way to go through conversation, through words. I think it's a very interesting thing in your novel that there's something that I love, because you write about the way that the toxic relationships can change into healthy ones when things are told and shared. I think that maybe you will agree with me. Then fiction can make reality change. I don't know if you think so.
I do agree with you. I mean, and I think that it is, I can see the impulse and feel the impulse behind thinking otherwise, right? Like this idea that fiction can't change anything, or that literature can't change anything. But fiction has changed so many different things in my own life, and not even just writing it, you know, just like as being like a reader, being an audience member, privy to the words of folks that, you know, have chosen to share them, and the narratives that they've chosen to share them. They've changed my own arc in a lot of significant ways. So it's important to me, this notion that, you know, we can write toward the narratives that we would like to see, and we can write toward the change that we would like to see, not at the expense of all the other mechanisms and components of enacting change, but it certainly is a significant component in and of itself.
Yeah, I had the feeling when I was reading your book, Memorial, I had the feeling that there was full of truth. And I also was thinking that maybe you, as a lot of good writers, you have been telling the truth through your fiction.
Yeah. There's a thing that my friend Chris Gonzalez, like he likes to say, which is that like none of it happened, but all of it is true. And I think
Yeah.
that is very much the case in my own work, in that there's very little strict autobiography that I pull from, largely because that's just, as a project, that's not particularly interesting for me on my own, although I love reading the work of folks who are able to accomplish it. But every character, every arc, every relationship and digression and dissolution of relationship, or even repair of a relationship, has like some root or some inkling of truth from my own experience or the experiences of my friends. And I think that that sort of like inkling, or that sort of like kernel of truth, is what really makes a great story for me as a reader or as a member of an audience. And oftentimes as a writer on the writing end, it's from that inkling or kernel of truth that I'm able to extend and to branch off into like the individual trajectories and the individual lives of the characters, so that they may have, you know, a lived experience as a foundation, but by the end of the process, the goal hopefully is that they will be very much themselves, like Benson and Mike and Mitsuko. They will be very much their own people in lieu of stemming directly from me.
Yeah, because while I was reading the book, I wonder myself, maybe you will have liked not to have your photo in the cover of the book, because in that way the readers will not know or will not associate directly your face with one of the characters. Because I have the feeling that I will love not knowing who is the author, who is putting more of his own life in the story, but at the same time I have the feeling that you are in all the characters. I don't know if you agree.
Yeah, I do agree. I mean, I think that there are parts of me in each of the characters. I mean, I think that friends have told me that the characters that I most resemble are probably not the characters that most people would immediately assume that I resemble. But the photography of it all, like I certainly see the notion of like a reader's immediately feeling inclined to make like direct I suppose correlation between characters and myself, between a character like Benson and Bryan. But that's not necessarily like how I read a text. I mean, I'm usually just privy to whatever the author would like to share with me, wherever they would ultimately like to lead me. And while that's certainly okay, like if a reader would like to approach it that way, I'm indifferent about it. You know, I don't mind like having my photo on the text, even if only because it gives me a sense of like the inner life of like the book as a project. Like, where did it originate from? Photos can tell so many stories and of themselves. So I just view it as being like a larger part of like the book as a product, in lieu of like being a part of the story itself.
And the most important thing is that it was a good photo.
yeah, well, that's much appreciated. Yeah,
you look great. So that's the most important thing. Another question I have for you, for me as a reader, I was fascinated in the way you were able to make the reader love and understand every of the characters in the novel. And they are not easy ones. Some of them are quite complex. But when I finished the book, I wanted to hold them all, because I understood them. I didn't agree with them, but I understood what was happening with them. I understood the way they looked at life, the way they look at things that were happening around. And this is very difficult to get. And I think it's a very, very good thing you do in your novel, because every time I think maybe I wouldn't be a friend of this person, but I understand and I want to help her. So were you aware of this while you were writing the book?
That's really thoughtful of you to say. I mean, I think that for me, my ultimate goal when I'm thinking through a character, whether they are a protagonist, whether they are at least front-facing as a supporting character, or even if they're a character that only appears within a scene, is less a desire for me to want or to will like a reader to like them, or even to like dislike them, so much as to perhaps understand where they're coming from. You know, it was important to me that a reader walk away from Memorial not thinking that, you know, a particular relationship worked or didn't work because of one individual person, so much as showing the reader that this is who this person is, this is why they've made the decisions that they've made. These are the catalysts for why they think the way they do, why they act the way they do. and perhaps they have the opportunity to change these things if they would like to. And I found that just me, like as a reader, I generally prefer when an author just shows me like who a person is without necessarily like guiding me to feel one way or another about a particular character. That's when I think I've had like my most gratifying reading experiences. So it's something that I reach toward on my own and, my various projects. It was very important to me in Memorial.
Cool, because when I was reading, I had the feeling that you knew perfectly all the characters, but they didn't know between each other. So they started knowing each other in your writing, in your novel, and maybe that's why the novel is so truthful, because you knew the ones you were talking about, but they didn't know between each other, and they started their relationship, and things happen.
That's a really good point. I mean, I think that a part of what could lend to that is that for me, so much of my writing is about communication and the ability to communicate or not to communicate, like the ability to like bridge a gap or like not to bridge a gap. And while, communication is certainly a primary point for me. So it's autonomy, like allowing characters the ability to like
Yeah.
change their mind or allowing them to have control over their own trajectory. And so writing these characters in such a way that they feel that they know themselves, but can still be the recipients of surprise or can still be open to changing like crucial components about themselves, whether it's the way that they communicate, whether it's the way that they view the world or the way that they view a relationship, I think is important to me because these shifts and like the accumulation of these shifts are what can make a life, like a series of decisions that lead to other decisions that lead to larger or smaller changes over time for an individual person. So it is essential, I think, for me to have like as comprehensive of a sense of who each character is as I possibly can, because I think it's only when I have a sense of like who these characters are that they can begin to live a life outside of what I necessarily may have planned. Like it becomes less, me writing a book about some people who are doing some things so much as my now having an understanding of who these people are and how perhaps they can react and change to the events and scenes that, will follow or that will be depicted later on in the book, which is like a subtle difference linguistically, but like in practice for me, I found that it makes a pretty significant difference in like how I'm writing a narrative and what actually is resulting from those efforts.
There's another thing I loved in the novel is the way you talk about things which are not perfect or sometimes are even broken, as sex, family, love, health. There's nothing perfect in this book, but at the same time, not everything is holding you in a one way. I don't know. It's like offers you a very warm sensation of being alive, and I think it's a novel against these times, because these times everything on Instagram is perfect, but I assume that perfection or is death or is Instagram, no other way. How did you work with the imperfect things in the life and in the novel, and how were you able to explain, because I think you explained it so well, that perfection is something that someone told us things have to be, but everything is completely different, and maybe that's the way they are perfect.
That's such a good question. I think that for me, what felt important was to write characters whose sense of who they were and who they wanted to be were constantly in the midst of being formed. And the process of that sort of like becoming wasn't one that I felt like I needed to end by the final page of the narrative. I mean, I think that for me, at least, for many of my friends, and certainly toward my characters, even the sort of epiphany or realization that one can do something differently, right? Like there are other options, or perhaps there are other pathways, even just that sort of like illumination or realization that like, oh, I can actually be this way, or oh, perhaps this is how I derive pleasure, or like, oh, perhaps this component of my being or selfhood that I've always approached as being imperfect, or I've always approached as being less than, maybe it just is without any sort of negative connotation. It's just a part of me along with every other component or part of me. Even the sort of like realization of that, I think, is like a massive shift for a person to have. Certainly it was a massive shift for me. So I think my desire in many different ways to articulate that and to sort of like provide language around it, because I can speak to it a little bit now, but like I could, like even 4 or 5 years ago, like I couldn't in many different ways. Like I wrote Memorial in order to find a way to construct the language to be able to talk about the sort of illumination that one can have and the many different shifts that can result from it. It was really important to me because there's so many different ways in which, you know, Western media generally, to say nothing of like US literary fiction specifically, sort of eschews this idea of like perfection of an entity, or sort of like unchanging person, right? A sort of like static entity, when that is just very seldom the case. I think certainly from my own experience and, you know, the experiences of friends and acquaintances, and it's not the sort of narrative that I want to read generally. Like I'm really drawn to characters that are constantly figuring themselves out, constantly finding out new things about themselves and allowing themselves to see wherever those various trajectories take them, whether or not they're sort of like written trajectories that they can point to models in their families, their friends, their lovers, or what have you, or if it's something that they themselves like are experiencing for the first time, they're sort of forging their own path for the first time. I've said like in other conversations that in a lot of ways, Memorial is a book about trying to be okay, or trying to figure out what it means to be okay, which is a sort of like misnomer in that there's no like one way to be, right? There's no one way to be comfortable. There's no one way to have pleasure. There's no one way to feel good or okay. And there are as many different routes for that as there are people. And by the time that, you know, one has a sense of like, okay, this is okay for me, perhaps that's changed, and, you know, that's okay. So that, I suppose, is one of the larger grace notes that I was reaching toward in writing the book. Just this sort of underlying idea for each of the characters that however they are is, you know, it's fine, it's great, it's okay, but they can also change their minds, and providing them the opportunity to change their minds and creating a narrative that allowed them to change their minds was something that was extremely important to me.
And I think it works perfectly. There's another thing that were quite amazing for me is the way you put yourself a big challenge, which is using different places to talk about different stories. I don't know your relationship with Japan. How long have you been there? Or why did you decide to put the story in Houston? That I guess is the place you know perfectly. But I'm not sure you were. How long have you been in Japan, or why did you choose Japan as a place for the novel?
Yeah, that's a great question. For me, so just biographical information, prior to the pandemic and the closing of borders, among other things, I would spend my summers in Japan. So most years for like the past while, I'd spend, you know, 2 or 3 months in Osaka. I was just visiting friends and just sort of hanging out. And I think it was, I mean, at this point, 7 years ago, when I had what felt to me like a sort of a realization that there were similarities in the rhythms of Osaka as a city and Houston as a city, but I couldn't quite articulate what that looked like, because front facing, they're quite different cities. And, you know, Houston, US city, for starters, it's also like a quite diverse city, whereas Osaka, major city of an island nation, front facing is a sort of like monocultural city. And yet I found like the more that I thought about it, when I allowed myself like the time to think about it, there were similarities, and that these were and are both port cities. So you have quite a lot of different cultures that are making their way through them. They're cities that are very much defined by their sort of culinary foodways and their residents' affections toward those foodways. They're both cities where the residents are quite humorous and quite comfortable with themselves and their relationships to their cities. And once I began to see like the similarities as I experienced them, my own personal experience, it felt interesting to me to find a narrative, or to try to find a narrative in which these two places that are at first glance so different from one another, but in lived experience feel, like sister cities almost, could coincide and could interact with one another. And I think that it was because of like my inability to like find that book on a shelf that I was just curious about what it would ultimately look like, or what it could ultimately look like to write it. And for quite a long time, like in the midst of writing the book, I wasn't sure if it was something that could be viable, or if it was something that made like a sort of like logical sense. But as the narrative developed and as the characters developed, and not only like my sense of who they were became established, but my sense of like how characters changed from city to city, and how they changed from context to context surfaced, it began to feel more viable until it felt a sort of, I suppose, verisimilitude between, the changes that the characters were experiencing as I moved from city to city, and the changes that I myself have experienced in moving from city to city, in the way that, context can impact so much about how we not only see ourselves, but how we see those around us, and what we think is possible, or what we think is viable for us, or what brings us pleasure, or what we like, or who we are, who we feel that we can be. So having these different locations in the novel, and having characters experience different versions of themselves as they bounce from location to location, or even characters that spend the brunt of the time in the same location, felt like a nice way to at least broach that conversation. And it's one that I think I'm going to be thinking about for some time in later projects down the line.
And I think that's really interesting, because you find something in the characters when they are out of their places, where they are like expats in even in an emotional way, that is really good for the story. And I also want to talk about the food, because it's very beautiful how you talk about how relationships with food are very important in this novel, and how some characters have them, and how things change when food is made at home, or when someone brings food from a restaurant where they work. I mean, there's something explaining perfectly the way they build the relationships also through food.
Yeah, food in the novel for me felt like a pretty crucial component, partly because like I just enjoy reading about food, and I enjoy reading about people who enjoy reading about food. But it also serves as another language that the characters are utilizing in order to understand one another, in the same way that verbal cues serve as a way of learning about one another. Texting serves as a way of learning about one another. Photography serves as a way of learning about one another. It's a significant choice, I think, when a character who has no sense of what a kitchen is, and for whom cracking an egg is like witchcraft, so to speak, decides to learn how to cook their partner's favorite dish, right? In the same way that I think it's a significant shift when a character takes the time to teach someone a language, in this particular instance, like a culinary language that they may have not had any familiarity with whatsoever. It's a sort of like passing on of knowledge, sure, and like a skill, sure, but it is also, or can be, like a form of care, right? Like I'm teaching someone how to nourish themselves and how to nourish other people, and this is a skill that they can hold on to long after our relationship is perhaps done, or even as our relationships progresses in tandem with each other. This is just another way that we can have to commune with one another. So trying to find different ways to allow the characters to have
these conversations about care, to have these conversations about labor, because cooking is labor in and of itself. It is an effort that someone is exerting in order to provide you with nourishment, or to provide themselves with nourishment. Felt like a nice vehicle that cooking could support from scene to scene and from character to character, albeit in different ways. And because each character's approach to cooking and to cuisine is so different from that of their partners and their friends, I think it allowed, sorry, it's like the word outside. Because their approach is so different, I think it allowed me to hopefully branch that conversation off into myriad components.
And do you know how to cook all the dishes you write in a book, or are you a very brighter than cooker?
Yeah. So for me, like, I had to cook every dish that appeared in the book.
Oh, good.
A few times before it appeared. And I think that it was important for me because there are many different people who are cooking in the text, but their skill levels vary, right? There is at least one cook who has no familiarity whatsoever with like knife, fork, spoon, frying pan, all of these things. And there are other characters who are quite comfortable with not only their culinary skills, but also their sense of like what brings pleasure to them and those around them. So in order to write about these dishes, I felt that I had to have a sense of how someone who wasn't familiar with certain techniques would approach a certain technique, as well as how someone who was quite familiar and quite proficient with certain techniques and certain ways of being in a kitchen space would approach that, and language at a language level that varies pretty significantly. And it wasn't until I felt that, you know, I had a handle of how to describe these things by way of my having done them myself, that I felt that I could give language, or a sort of language, to each of those like varied experiences.
I don't know if you like people to say you have written a gay novel or gay literature, or you don't care because mainly the main characters are gay, but you are not talking special about gay culture or gay stereotypes. I think maybe if I had to put it in label, I will call it queer, because it's more free relationships, new ways to reinvent things within how they have to do. But I'm not sure that your book is into the gay culture. I don't know what you think about this.
I like it when people call it a gay novel. I love it when people call it a queer novel.
Oh, cool.
It's really important to me in my writing, partly because like as like a reader, I wasn't privy, certainly like as an early reader, just like as a kid growing up, I did not have access to queer literature. I didn't have access to queer film, to queer television. I didn't have access to out queer people in my immediate or even peripheral circle.
But you're really young.
Yeah, I'm really young. But even now,
I'm much older than you, and I understand my case. But you are young enough. I mean, what I try to say with this is that we are not so advanced as they are trying to tell us.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah. I mean, there is, which I think is its own thing, meriting like its own particular conversation. But I think that for me, each character's approach to their queerness and their sense of what it can mean to be queer and how that can change for them as time passes, as contexts shift for them, was just as important to me to capture as any other component of the narrative. So to have a character like Benson, who feels that he is relatively comfortable with himself, but whose relationship to his own queerness, to his sense of like what a relationship looks like, to his sense of like what obligation can mean, what monogamy can mean, what the lack thereof can mean, have that shift and change over the course of the novel felt important to me in the same way that it felt important to have a character like Mike, whose sense of himself and his queerness and his relationship to monogamy or the lack thereof changes as time passes, and also as he shifts from one city to another and has to recontextualize himself as his context shifts. It felt important to me to have those conversations, because those are the conversations that I have with my friends, the conversations that I have at bars, just like out in the world, questions that I myself haven't come up with answers for, but I'm not necessarily interested in coming up with answers for those questions in my own life, to say nothing of like the text in and of itself. So I really prioritize queer selfhood for each of these characters, but also it's important to me to allow them to have the space and the time to grow and change. I mean, at least I feel like in US literary fiction, there is a way of writing about queer characters and queer contexts in which they are not allowed the space to change. Like they exist as sort of like static entities, and those entities are either depicted from the standpoint of being entirely positive and entirely perfect, or entirely dismal and entirely irretrievable, when I found, at least like in my own life and my own experience, that it's never a binary. It's almost always somewhere in the middle, and more often than that, it oscillates from one end to the other. So allowing that sort of dynamism for each character's understanding of like what queerness is or can mean to them, and how it can change and how that can impact their relationships, whether they're romantic or platonic, is something that felt interesting to me, just as it felt interesting to me to like queer the structure of like what a love story could look like. You know, like what does it mean when a love story starts from the vantage point of two characters who already love one another, but perhaps they don't have the language for it? Or what can it mean when a reader's understanding of like what a relationship is on the page is constantly shifting from moment to moment, in the same way that the characters' understandings of themselves and their queerness is like constantly shifting from moment to moment. So it's something that, you know, was really important to me, and something that it felt important to prioritize in the midst of writing it.
Yes, and for me, the queerest relationship in the book is the one they have, the two straight men who are the father and his waiter in Osaka. I think it's a very beautiful way of showing a new way of family. Or there's a writer, I don't know if you know him, Armstead Maupin. He used
Mhm.
it,
Of the city,
he
yeah.
he said something very beautiful about how we change biological family to logical family. And I think that the waiter and the father, they create a logical family there in Osaka, no?
Yeah, very much so. And then that quote is one that I think is really important to me, because something that has surfaced, I've found for me, as sort of like recurring theme in the various things that I write, are the ways in which family can be so flexible, right? Or the idea of like a found family, which I think is pretty synonymous, at least now in contemporary literature, with this idea of like a queer family, how you can sort of like choose the people that you would like to have in your life, or the people that support you, the people that you can provide support for, that you can both serve as like foundations for one another. It's something that I've always been circling around, even before, you know, I started writing professionally, and before I started like reading with the intent to write. So the different ways in which the characters that may not necessarily be blood family find ways and find points of attachment to one another. Even, you know, thinking of like the bar in Osaka, like specifically the way in which the patrons find themselves like indebted and responsible for, and feel a sense of like caring toward the other bar patrons, toward the other bar staff, creating points of community, creating points of care that are in some cases even stronger than the care that is shown between like blood family members, between brothers and sisters and fathers and children. That feels like especially queer, you know, because it is,
Yeah,
you know, a route outside of like what someone has been told that a family should be, or like the way that a person
sure.
could or should be. Yeah.
Uh, you said before that you didn't have a very you arrived late to queer culture, or you didn't have queer reference. And do you remember the books, the first queer books you read, or the first queer films or TV shows where you said, okay, they are talking about someone like me, or someone like who could be me?
That's a really good question. I think I could say that the very first queer
text that I was privy to was Giovanni's Room by James Baldwin.
Yeah.
It was a text that I came across relatively late. I think it was like the first few years of university for me, and it really struck a chord with me, this ability to find recognition within the text, this ability like to find like a sort of like trajectory within the text, but it also dismayed me deeply. It's quite a tragic book, right? And I
Yeah.
think that I was simultaneously just as fortunate to find, I suppose, like queerness in film, which I think were like my first points of attachment as far as queer narratives were concerned, whether it was watching films like Happy Together, or whether it was watching films like Weekend, or whether it was watching films like Spa Night, whether it was watching films like Moonlight to some extent, or Beautiful Thing to some extent, or My Private Idaho to some extent. So my language, as far as like how queerness can exist inside of narrative, or at least like the formative language, was predominantly informed by the language of film. And it was after that sort of language had been formed for me that I came across, queer texts, as sort of like written queer texts, and it proved, I suppose, to be a sort of like circuitous route, but one that I'm very grateful for, because having seen the ways that queer narratives could shift and could contort themselves and could end up in like myriad directions on film, really reinforced for me that queer narratives don't have to be tragedy all the time, right? They don't have to be tragic all of the time, unless an author or storyteller chooses to do that. And these are certainly essential narratives on their own, but they do not have to be the only narrative. I think that having that understanding prior to my own foray into writing queer fiction was something that just was really helpful, because it allowed many different points of entry for me narratively. Whereas I think if I'd only been privy to the sort of like tragic queer trajectory, that itself, would have informed my writing, and maybe not the same way. So I'm very grateful for, the queer films that I had access to, and the queer literature that I had access to quite early on.
Yeah, and I think it's very important what you said. That books and texts you say, and the movies, there was also a drama thing with being queer, no? And I think that your novel is full of light, and there's no right there. Daily dramas like everybody has, but not especially. And I also like the way of poetical justice, which is the way you talk about VH8s in the book, because it's something that in the gay queer culture during a long time was something tragic, and suddenly you can write about this in a very not at all light way, but in a very daily way. Is something that happens, something you have to take care of, and that in this book, I like the way you show it. Talks more about the partners than about the people with illness.
Yeah, and that felt important. Thank you for that. And it felt important to me, because there is so much stigma surrounding HIV. There is so much stigma surrounding folks who are POS, right? And I myself just have not been privy to very much in US literary fiction, where characters who are POS, and certainly characters who are not white and are POS, are treated and written with dignity, and written with autonomy, and written with the benefit of the doubt. So it was extremely important to me to write, in the case of Memorial specifically, a character like Benson, who is POS, and it is a part of his life. It's a part of his character or characteristic, but it is not the sole characteristic that he has, or the sole component of his life. It's not the thing that determines all of his actions and prospects, and it's certainly not like a ceiling for him as far as like his narrative arc is concerned. Trying to write characters whose identifiers and whose characteristics aren't, I suppose, solely utilized as labels or solely utilized as elements that detract from who they are, or something that's important to me, regardless of who I'm writing about. But particularly when I'm writing queer characters, and particularly when I'm writing pause queer characters, because unfortunately it's just not a lot. There's not a lot of that, at least in U.S. Literary fiction. So it felt like a privilege in many different ways to have the chance to do it.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful the way you treat it in the book, and I liked it because you know perfectly the way and the measure and everything is fine, and I loved finding it, and I thought, oh, cool! Finally, after all these years, someone can tell this story this way. So yeah, and there's something that I like, maybe because you are extremely young. I mean, there's something of bad taste. I should tell you, you shouldn't be so young, but it's something you don't worry, it will change. It will go away. But talking about queer literature, queer books, there's something in your book that I think, fortunately, is happening in the queer literature. Is that years before it used to talk about the me literature, the I literature, and I think your book talks from the us. And I think it's a change, really, really positive. Don't know if you agree with this.
That's very kind of you, and it's a change that I think is, I don't know, is like needed. You know, I think it's a change that at least myself as a reader, like I'm beginning to see more of, and I'm grateful that I'm beginning to see more of this emphasis on the essentialness of community, or this essentialness of identifying not only like as yourself and your own sort of like struggles and your own sort of trajectory, so much as that of your neighbors, that of your partners, that of your friends, that of your acquaintances. And I think that as my own relationship and relationships to community change and oscillate and shift and have shifted, it'll continue to surface in my own writing. And it was certainly something that was shifting, that was forming and reforming and redeveloping as I was writing Memorial, right? Like really seeing the ways in which community and one's relationship to their community or their communities just make for such a sense and a place of care, right? Create such a sense of a foundation, create such a sense of the many different ways that like you can direct your life if you so choose, you know, like having models like in your own life, serving as a model for other folks by way of, you know, being the person that you are, the person that you would like to be. I mean, I think that all of these things are just so crucial, to say nothing of like how specifically crucial they are to queer folks and the way that they can be crucial to queer folks. And I'm someone who is deeply indebted to the folks in my community who've just been just very caring for me, who've been very supportive toward me, who've served as like friends toward me, that are as much family to me as like blood family that I have. So trying to figure out ways to put that on the page was top of mind for me in Memorial, and continues to be so, and other things that I've, you know, I'm working on and that I'm working toward.
Are you writing a new novel now, or are you just having a rest? What are you doing?
Yeah, I wish I was having rest. Yeah, so I finished. Oh God, like, can you imagine? Like, so I actually finished the next book. I'm working on it maybe a month ago. So I'm working on it with my US editor now, just wrapping up edits. I think that it'll be released in the US next fall. But of course, you know, as the publication dates are always shifting, but my sense is that it'll be released next year in the US. And in line with that, I've been working on a few different television projects. I've been working and wrapping up like a few different short stories that are in various stages of completion here, there, in the world. So I'm very fortunate, particularly like in the midst of this pandemic, in the midst of these changing times, you have had, you know, consistent work, and not only consistent work, but consistent work telling the stories that I would like to tell, or telling like the queer stories that I would like to tell. So I've been very busy, for better or worse, but it's been an exciting time nonetheless.
But these are going to be good news for me.
Yeah, well, I'm glad to hear it. Yeah.
No, cool. Is it going to be a novel or short stories?
It'll be a novel. Yeah, the next book is a novel.
Cool. And do you have the title, or you can say?
I think that I'll fall in like a trapdoor if I say, so I probably shouldn't mention it.
Don't do it. Okay. Okay, Bryan, for me, that's enough. It's been such a pleasure reading you, knowing you, and realizing that you are the kind guy I wanted to know after reading your book. So you can be relieved.
Thank you. I am relieved. Thank you, Bob. I appreciate it.
My pleasure, and have a nice day.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Bye.